From Pinballs to Pixels is a comprehensive look at Williams and how they became the center of Chicago's pinball and video game industry for a brief period of time. Ken Horowitz does an excellent job of documenting the history of Williams, and I like how he tells this story. However, I wish more time had been spent on the other big companies like Bally, Midway, and Gottlieb. We start off with the history and kind of the origins of the Chicago pinball industry. This explains how the significant companies ended up in Chicago, who founded each one of them, and just the parts that they would play in the story that Ken is explaining to us. Gottlieb, Stern, Chicago Coin are talked about briefly, but they aren't as crucial as Midway is going to be. They also aren't mentioned as much as Bally and Midway either, which makes a lot of sense once you get into this story and you realize just how these companies would end up buying each other up or would end up licensing and acquiring the IPs of the previous companies. There is more to the story than just pinball and video games, especially when talking about Williams. But that's for another section in this. There are a few companies that I had never heard of before reading this book. They aren't all that important to the narrative, but I was glad to see that it wasn't just the 4 companies that I knew about. Ken also goes over other coin-op amusement devices and games that were bought and sold at this time. The industry dates all the way back to the late 1800s, and there are probably some more amusement games before that, specifically in like the 1850s or something like that, but I'm not totally aware of it, and I haven't seen a lot of historical coverage on that. I found the long history of Williams to be very interesting, especially how Harry Williams, the company's founder, didn't start out at Williams. He started out at a few other companies, and he had tried his hand multiple times in order to really get this whole amusement thing going. He ends up retiring and kind of being semi-retired several times during this story. It just kind of adds to the story of the Chicago pinball industry, and it helps to explain really the effect or the impact that he had on the industry, whether it was coming up with different innovations or having simultaneous inventions going on. It's pretty cool to see how certain things get attributed to him, and then Ken goes and says, well, that might be true, but you can also see that a similar device was being used at the same time, or these other devices were released around the same period, so you don't really know exactly who came up with certain things. The tilt switch is one of those inventions, where it's attributed to Williams, but the term had been around before that, and you can find other devices that were doing similar things to what the tilt mechanism would do. Williams is the company that Ken focuses on for the majority of the book. It has a long history in coin-op amusement. It's also interesting to see how it started in Los Angeles and ended up moving to Chicago. Williams was the company that really drove innovation in the pinball industry. However, Ken points out how some simultaneous innovation was going on at the time. It's really hard to tell who was first, as I mentioned earlier. He also does a great job of pointing out the inconsistencies between multiple sources when discussing certain features, and also when discussing some of the historical points, where one person will mention this happened, and then he will go and find more information on it to point out that, well, no, it didn't necessarily happen that way, but these are the things that he might have been thinking about. The pinball tables and the people who created them are gone over. Ken gives the reader a snapshot of the important tables. usually the ones that did something new or were significant in sales. New tables are brought up throughout the book because of when the historical timeline begins. He does an excellent job of bringing up how Williams found success with video games before the North American video game crash. However, the few years before the crash are really the most interesting for Williams. It was able to survive mostly because of its pinball division, and that kind of shows the ups and downs that run through this book on the pinball industry. They'll have some boom years and then they'll have some down years. And it just happened to be that the boom years took place during the video game crash. And then when video games came back, pinball dipped back down. They did make a few attempts at putting out video games during the video game crash, but that was quietly abandoned for the most part, just because they were seeing that the distributors weren't being able to sell them, the people weren't really playing them as much, and overall, there just wasn't a space for video games for a brief period, especially with the arcades, which was most of what Williams was doing at the time. The other Chicago companies had pretty much abandoned pinball prior to the video game crash, and many of them were just kind of wiped out or absorbed by other companies. It's kind of crazy to see some of that stuff happen, and in fact, that's how Williams ended up acquiring Bally and Midway. It's kind of weird with Bally because they seem to have acquired parts of the company and then other parts weren't. It's a rather confusing story, and Ken does his best to explain it, but I was still a little bit lost on it. This part about the video game crash was fascinating. It's all about a lot of these smaller parts of the larger story that I found very interesting, but the overall story, it was fine, but I think like the little slices of the story were more interesting than the whole part of it. Licensing deals and pinball versions of arcade games are brought up. These were attempts by Williams to really keep the pinball division alive before the video game crash. They weren't all that successful, and Williams briefly abandoned pinball before turning back to it during the video game crash, and the years in between the crash and when they got their video game division started up again. In the late 80s, Williams really made a push to get video games back, and they were very successful in doing so. It really helped to usher in kind of that second period of the arcades, really in the late 80s and throughout the 90s when they released things like Smash TV, and then Mortal Kombat, NBA Jam, and Cruisin' USA. They were able to really keep themselves afloat for a while. Unfortunately, as the arcades died, the business also died with it, and Williams had to shift more towards home console, and they just didn't really do that great when they went over to the home consoles. I'll get more into that in just a little bit. The same thing that brought Williams' success also led to their downfall. This is a conclusion I came to after reading Ken's book, as well as other accounts on the video game arm of Williams. They fell behind as they tied themselves to the arcade scene. Home consoles had surpassed arcade games by quite a bit from a graphical standpoint, from sound, and just from the overall sales that they could do. Back in the 80s, a home console could not do the same things that an arcade game could, but once you got into the late 90s and early 2000s, there wasn't that separation anymore, and in most cases, the home console was surpassing or better than the arcade version. There was also the problem of just arcades going away. There were fewer places to put an arcade game, and there were just more home consoles out there. So many publishers and developers were moving to the home console and also to PC, as opposed to making arcade games. Ken throws a ton of numbers at the reader when he's talking about both pinball games and video games. Selling 20,000 arcade cabinets or pinball tables is considered a huge success, compared to a home console where that would be an incredibly low number. You're just talking about a different product, a different market, and a different audience than what you would with a home console or sales on something like the Dreamcast, PS1, PS2, so on and so forth. There's also the case of the pinball industry as well. They tried to do some new things with pinball, but the market was just really down by the late 90s. Other manufacturers had mostly left the market, and this gave Williams a 75% market share. The problem was there was just a lack of demand from the operators, not necessarily from people playing the games, but people who were buying them and distributing the games didn't really want them. So you have the last few pinball tables that Williams made selling right around like 5,000 tables. That was considered a success, but not enough of one to really keep the industry going. There is also some speculation from Ken in here that Williams just up and abandoned pinball altogether. And yeah, I can see his point, because after they sold their last table, it was kind of deemed a bit of a success. They just left the market altogether and didn't really keep going. They probably could have, but there was a lot more going on at Williams at the time. And by the end of the 2000s, Williams was shut down and all the intellectual property was sold off to Warner Brothers. Most notably, Mortal Kombat was sold off, and then, well, you now have a whole bunch of really awesome Mortal Kombat games. This was the disappointing part of the book for me. It isn't that big of a deal, and I understand that Ken couldn't have put everything into this book, but this kind of bugged me a little bit. With the focus on Williams, so many things like Midway's licenses of Pac-Man and other games aren't really covered in depth. And you also don't have the Bally Astrocade being talked about really at all. I might have missed that part, but I don't remember seeing it in the book. The two companies are mentioned throughout the book because they really have to be. They're really more brought up in the 80s and the 90s, especially after Williams purchased part of each company. Bally is mentioned in Pinball. Midway is talked about really once you get into the 80s and 90s. It's not really discussed a whole lot before that. Midway's licenses are kind of briefly mentioned when bringing up Williams's licensed games. But yeah, there's not really too much to go there. They were instrumental in reviving video games for Williams, specifically Midway, but there is more to their story than what is really presented here. A few other books that I've read have kind of filled in the gaps. And again, I understand why everything wasn't included, or at least why everything I wanted to be included wasn't, but it was still a bit of a disappointment. I think Bally really has the more interesting story than Williams does, especially when you're talking about video games, and there was a lot connected, or a lot about the Astrocade that isn't brought up, and I would have loved to have heard more about that. But that's probably something that I'll have to look into somewhere else, because it's just not in here, which is kind of a shame. Some of the stories about Bally and Midway are kind of ignored by focusing on Williams. This doesn't mean that the book is bad, and it doesn't mean that it's not telling a complete story. It just means that some parts of the Chicago pinball history is not really going to be in here. Some parts of their video game history are not really going to be in here. Ken's just telling the story that he wants to tell, which is perfectly fine, but as the reader, I wanted to know more about Bally and Midway than I did about Williams. Maybe they'll show up in another book that Ken does, or maybe they'll be covered by another author. Who knows? This is one of those strange books where I really liked the beginning of it, and I liked the ending of it, but the middle wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. There isn't anything wrong with it, but it did feel a little bit repetitive at times, much like Ken's other books. I wasn't sure that all of the games needed to be in here, and all the pinball tables that he talks about needed to be in here. At some point, I feel like he's just mentioning stuff over and over again in order to advance the story, where he probably could have told the story without some of these tables and some of these arcade games. It's just one of those things where it's kind of a personal opinion. If I was writing this, I might include stuff that Ken didn't necessarily think was important. It's just a weird thing with writing and coming up with ideas for stuff. Whenever I read one of Ken's books, I get ideas for future projects. It's one of the many reasons I really enjoy reading them. There's so many stories from the 70s, 80s, and 90s that had an impact on video game history, and Ken tends to touch on several of the ones that I find personally interesting. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. I feel like I might have kept you guys too long. I will talk to you all later. Bye.